The desert wind carried dust across the barbed wire fences of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, in the late summer of 1945, and with it came the sound of silence, the kind of silence that settles over men who have surrendered not just their weapons but their understanding of the world. The Japanese prisoners of war who arrived at the camp came with their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the foreign soil beneath their feet, carrying the weight of shame that their culture had taught them was heavier than death itself. They had been told stories about American brutality, about torture and execution, about the savage fate that awaited those who fell into enemy hands. They had been instructed to die rather than face this dishonor. Yet here they were, alive, breathing the strange air of the American Midwest, waiting for the punishment they believed was inevitable. What they could not have known, what no amount of propaganda or military training could have prepared them for, was that waiting for them inside the camp administration building was a single sheet of paper that would shatter every assumption they carried in their hearts. It was written in their own language, in the graceful characters of Japanese script, and it began with a word they never expected to see: welcome. The idea had come from Captain James Hendrickson, a man whose own journey to this moment had been shaped by a peculiar confluence of circumstances. Before the war, Hendrickson had been a professor of East Asian studies at a small college in Oregon, a man who had spent years studying Japanese literature and philosophy, who had walked the streets of Kyoto and Tokyo in the 1930s as a young scholar, who had sat in temples listening to monks chant sutras and had learned to appreciate the subtle beauty of a language that expressed entire worlds of meaning in the space between words. When war came, his knowledge made him valuable to military intelligence, but it also left him with a profound discomfort, a sense that the enemy he was fighting was far more complex and human than the propaganda posters suggested. Standing in his office at Camp McCoy, looking out at the rows of barracks where the prisoners would be housed, Hendrickson held in his hands a draft of the welcome letter he had written. He had labored over each character, each phrase, knowing that the weight of this communication would be measured not just in the meaning of the words but in the mere fact of their existence. To write to these men in their own language was to acknowledge their humanity at the precise moment when they expected to be stripped of it. It was a gesture that defied the logic of war, and Hendrickson knew that some of his fellow officers would see it as weakness, as a dangerous softening toward men who had fought to kill Americans. But he also knew something else, something he had learned in those quiet temples years ago, that the space between enemies could be bridged by the smallest acts of recognition, by the acknowledgement that beneath the uniforms and the flags and the ideologies, there existed a shared capacity for suffering and for grace. The letter was brief, but every word had been chosen with care. It explained that the prisoners were under the protection of the Geneva Convention, that they would be treated humanely, that they would receive food and medical care, that they would be allowed to write letters home and to practice their religious beliefs. But more than these practical assurances, the letter contained something unexpected, an acknowledgement of the prisoners' courage, a recognition that they had fought honorably for their country, and an expression of hope that despite the circumstances of their captivity, they might find some measure of peace within the camp's boundaries. Hendrickson had wrestled with that last sentiment, wondering if it was too much, if it crossed some line between military necessity and sentimentality. But in the end, he left it in, believing that if there was any chance of reaching these men, of helping them navigate the psychological catastrophe of their surrender, it would be through honesty rather than through the cold efficiency of regulation. When the first group of prisoners was assembled in the camp's main yard on that August afternoon, the air thick with heat and tension, they stood in rigid formation, their faces masks of stoic acceptance. They had been processed, photographed, issued prison uniforms, and now they waited for whatever would come next: interrogation, perhaps, or the beginning of the harsh labor they assumed would be their fate. Instead, a young American soldier stepped forward, accompanied by a translator, a Japanese-American man named Thomas Hayashi, who had volunteered for military service despite his own family being held in an internment camp in California, a painful irony that he carried with him every day. Hayashi held up the letter, and his voice, speaking in Japanese, cut through the afternoon stillness with an almost shocking clarity. The prisoners' heads lifted almost involuntarily, drawn by the sound of their native tongue coming from this unexpected source. As Hayashi began to read, translating the words that Hendrickson had written, something extraordinary happened in that yard, a collective intake of breath, a subtle shift in posture, a barely perceptible release of tension that rippled through the assembled men like wind across water. For many of the prisoners, this was the first time since their capture that they had heard their language spoken with respect rather than as a tool of interrogation. The words themselves were startling enough, the assurances of humane treatment, the reference to the Geneva Convention, the promise of basic dignity, but what shook them even more profoundly was the mere existence of the letter, the fact that someone had taken the time to write to them in Japanese, to speak to them as human beings rather than as defeated enemies. Several of the younger prisoners felt tears burning behind their eyes, a dangerous weakness they had to suppress. Others felt a disorienting confusion, as if the ground beneath them had suddenly become unstable. They had been prepared for cruelty, for hardship, for death. They had not been prepared for kindness. Among the prisoners was a man named Takeshi Yamamoto, a former schoolteacher from Hiroshima who had been conscripted into the Imperial Army and sent to fight in the Pacific. Yamamoto had survived the Battle of Saipan, had watched his comrades die in the caves and on the beaches, and had been captured while barely conscious from dehydration and wounds. Throughout his journey from the battlefield to the prisoner transport ship to the train that brought him to Wisconsin, he had maintained a careful internal distance from reality, focusing only on the next moment, the next breath, refusing to think about what his capture meant for his family, for his honor, for his entire understanding of who he was. But standing in that yard, listening to those Japanese words spoken by the American translator, something in that careful distance cracked open. That night, lying on his bunk in the barracks, Yamamoto stared at the ceiling and tried to process what had happened. The welcome letter had been posted on the wall of each barracks building, and he found himself getting up to read it again, tracing the characters with his eyes, looking for some hidden meaning, some trap or trick. But the words remained consistent, remained sincere. He thought about his students back home, the young boys and girls he had taught literature and history to before the war consumed everything. He had taught them about honor and duty, about the Bushido Code and the importance of loyalty to the emperor. He had believed those teachings himself, had tried to live by them even as the war turned increasingly desperate and brutal. And yet here he was, alive when he should have died, treated with a dignity he had been told would never be granted, confronted with a gesture of humanity from the very enemy he had been taught to hate. The letter became a topic of intense discussion among the prisoners, whispered conversations after lights out, careful exchanges during the daily work details. Some insisted it was a trick, a psychological tactic designed to soften them up for interrogation or to extract cooperation. Others argued that it didn't matter whether it was a trick or not, the reality of their treatment would reveal the truth soon enough. But there were also those like Yamamoto who sensed something deeper at work, who recognized in that letter an olive branch extended across a chasm of violence and misunderstanding, who began to wonder if perhaps the world was more complicated than the narratives they had been fed. As the weeks passed, the prisoners' initial suspicions began to erode in the face of consistent treatment that matched the letter's promises. The food was adequate, sometimes even good, nothing like the starvation rations they had experienced in the final months of the war. Medical care was provided without discrimination. They were allowed to form work details that kept them occupied and gave them a sense of purpose. Religious services were permitted, and a small Buddhist altar was established in one of the barracks, a concession that stunned many of the prisoners who had expected their spiritual practices to be forbidden or mocked. Letters began to arrive from home, often heavily censored but still precious beyond measure, threads of connection to a world that seemed increasingly remote and almost dreamlike. Captain Hendrickson made it a practice to visit the prisoner areas regularly, always accompanied by Hayashi as translator, always careful to show respect while maintaining the necessary boundaries of security and military authority. He would stop and talk with small groups of prisoners, asking about their welfare, listening to their concerns, sometimes engaging in careful conversations about neutral topics, the weather, the strange landscape of Wisconsin, the differences between American and Japanese agriculture. These conversations were monitored and recorded, of course, as regulations required, but they were also genuine exchanges between human beings trying to navigate an impossible situation. It was during one of these visits that Yamamoto found himself in direct conversation with Hendrickson, a moment that would stay with both men for the rest of their lives. Hendrickson had noticed Yamamoto teaching younger prisoners to read and write English using borrowed books and makeshift materials, and he was curious about this educated man who carried himself with such quiet dignity despite his circumstances. Through Hayashi's translation, they began to talk about literature, about the books they had loved, about the act of teaching in a world that had temporarily abandoned education in favor of destruction. Hendrickson mentioned that he had studied in Japan before the war, that he had walked the same streets Yamamoto might have walked, had admired the same temples and gardens. This admission created a strange moment of recognition between them, an acknowledgement that in some other version of reality, they might have been colleagues or friends rather than captor and captive. "Why did you write the letter?" Yamamoto asked suddenly, the question emerging before he could censor himself. "In Japanese." "Why did you do that?" Hendrickson was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "Because," he finally said, "I wanted you to know, from the very first moment, that we saw you as men. Not as monsters, not as abstractions, but as human beings who had fought for their country and who now found themselves in an unimaginable situation. I wanted to give you that one small piece of recognition, in your own language, before anything else could happen." The translator conveyed these words, and Yamamoto felt something tighten in his chest. It was such a simple answer, and yet it contained within it an entire philosophy of how to treat those we have defeated, how to maintain our own humanity even in the midst of war's dehumanizing machinery. He nodded slowly, unable to trust his voice to respond, and after a moment Hendrickson moved on to speak with other prisoners, leaving Yamamoto standing there with tears he could not shed burning behind his eyes. The impact of the welcome letter extended far beyond that initial reading in the camp yard. Word of it spread through the network of prisoner camps across the United States, carried by transferred prisoners and sympathetic guards, becoming a symbol of a different possible approach to captivity. Some camps adopted similar practices, translating communications into Japanese and making efforts to acknowledge the cultural sensitivities of their prisoners. Others remained strictly formal and distant, adhering to the minimum requirements of the Geneva Convention without any additional gestures of humanity. But even in those camps, the story of Camp McCoy's welcome letter circulated as a legend, a small point of light in a landscape of fear and uncertainty. For the prisoners at Camp McCoy, the letter became something more, a touchstone to which they could return when doubts and despair threatened to overwhelm them. On difficult days, when news from Japan was grim, when letters from home stopped coming or brought devastating information about bombing raids and civilian casualties, when the reality of their situation and the unknown future that awaited them became too much to bear, they could look at that letter posted on the barracks wall and remember that they had been seen, had been acknowledged, had been welcomed in their own language at a moment when they expected only condemnation and violence. Yamamoto began to keep a journal, writing in tiny characters on any scrap of paper he could find, documenting not just the daily routines of camp life but also his own internal transformation. He wrote about the cognitive dissonance of being treated humanely by the enemy, about the slow dissolution of the certainties that had structured his understanding of the world, about the guilt of being alive when so many of his comrades were dead, about the strange hope that began to grow in him despite everything, a hope that if kindness could exist even here, even between enemies, then perhaps the world after the war might be different than the world that had led to it. The other prisoners noticed the change in Yamamoto, the way he seemed to carry himself differently, with less of the rigid self-punishment that characterized so many of them. He began to organize educational sessions, teaching English to those who wanted to learn, leading discussions about literature and philosophy, creating small spaces of intellectual engagement that gave the prisoners something to think about beyond their immediate circumstances. He never spoke explicitly about the welcome letter, but his actions seemed to flow from the opening it had created, from the possibility it represented. Summer turned to autumn, and the Wisconsin landscape transformed in ways that both enchanted and saddened the prisoners. Many of them had never seen such dramatic seasonal changes, the explosion of color in the maple and oak trees, the crisp cold that came with the morning frost. It was beautiful, but it was also alien, a reminder of how far they were from home, from the landscapes and seasons that had shaped their lives. The war in the Pacific was ending, though news was fragmentary and often conflicting. There were rumors of devastating new weapons, of entire cities destroyed in single attacks, of an imminent Japanese surrender. The prisoners listened to these rumors with a mixture of hope and dread, knowing that the end of the war would bring its own uncertainties. What would happen to them? Would they be allowed to return home? What kind of Japan would they be returning to? When the official announcement of Japan's surrender came in mid-August, the camp fell into a strange, heavy silence. Some prisoners wept openly, others sat in stunned disbelief, still others maintained a stoic facade that barely concealed their turbulent emotions. The surrender meant different things to different men. For some it was a relief, an end to the killing and dying. For others it was a betrayal, an abandonment of everything they had been told to believe. For still others it was simply incomprehensible, a rupture in reality too large to process. Captain Hendrickson, understanding the profound impact this news would have, arranged for the prisoners to gather for a special assembly, and once again Hayashi stood before them to translate his words. "The war is over," Hendrickson said, his voice steady but gentle. "I know that this news brings complex emotions for all of you. You have fought honorably for your country, and now your country has chosen peace. This is not a reflection on your courage or your dedication. It is simply the end of a conflict that has cost too many lives on all sides. You will remain here at Camp McCoy until arrangements can be made for your repatriation. I give you my word that you will continue to be treated in accordance with the standards we have maintained, and that we will do everything in our power to facilitate your safe return home when the time comes. In the meantime, I ask for your patience and your cooperation as we all navigate this new reality together." After the assembly, Yamamoto found himself walking the perimeter of the camp, his mind churning with thoughts too large and complex to contain. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Everything he had believed about his country's invincibility, about the emperor's divine mandate, about the necessity of fighting to the last man, all of it had been proven false. And yet, standing here in this American prison camp, alive and relatively well, treated with a dignity he never expected, he found himself unable to feel the crushing shame he had been taught should accompany such a moment. Instead, what he felt was something closer to relief, and beneath that relief, a fragile, tentative hope. The months that followed were a period of strange suspension, a liminal time between war and whatever would come after. The prisoners began to receive more news from Japan, and the picture that emerged was devastating: cities destroyed, the economy in ruins, millions of civilians dead or displaced, the entire social and political structure of the country in upheaval. Many prisoners learned that their families had been killed in bombing raids or in the final desperate battles. Others discovered that their homes no longer existed, that the landscapes of their childhood had been erased. The grief was overwhelming, and yet it had to be carried privately, processed in the quiet hours, expressed only in the most careful and controlled ways. It was during this time that Yamamoto asked Hendrickson for a favor. He wanted to write a letter to be given to American soldiers who might be occupying Japan, a letter that would explain something of Japanese culture and psychology to help them understand the people they would be dealing with. It was an audacious request, and Yamamoto himself wasn't entirely sure why he felt compelled to make it. Perhaps it was gratitude for the welcome letter he had received, a desire to reciprocate in some small way. Perhaps it was a recognition that the future of his country might depend on Americans understanding Japanese people as something more than fanatical enemies. Or perhaps it was simply an expression of the transformation he had undergone, a way of reaching across the divide that had separated their peoples and trying to build a bridge of understanding. Hendrickson agreed to the request, and over several weeks, Yamamoto drafted his letter with painstaking care. He wrote about concepts that had no direct English equivalents, about giri and ninjo, obligation and human feeling, about the importance of saving face and maintaining harmony, about the deep respect for hierarchy and the value placed on endurance and stoic acceptance of hardship. But he also wrote about the common humanity beneath these cultural differences, about the love of family and the desire for peace, about the capacity for change and adaptation that he had witnessed in himself and his fellow prisoners. He wrote about the welcome letter, about what it had meant to receive that recognition in his own language at his moment of greatest vulnerability, and he suggested that similar small gestures of respect and understanding might go a long way toward healing the wounds that the war had opened. When the letter was finished, Hendrickson read it carefully, struck by its wisdom and its generosity of spirit. This was a man who had every reason to be bitter, to be angry at the country that had defeated his own, and yet here he was, trying to help Americans understand and connect with Japanese people, trying to build something positive from the wreckage of war. Hendrickson made copies of the letter and sent them to his contacts in the military government that was preparing to occupy Japan, knowing that at least some of the officers heading to Tokyo and beyond might benefit from Yamamoto's insights. The process of repatriation began in the spring of 1946, a slow and complicated operation involving thousands of prisoners across multiple camps. The men of Camp McCoy waited their turn with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, preparing for a return to a homeland that many feared they would no longer recognize. As Yamamoto's turn approached, he found himself experiencing an unexpected sadness at the prospect of leaving, a strange attachment to this place that had been his prison but had also been the site of his transformation. He thought about the welcome letter, about that moment in the camp yard when everything he thought he knew about the world had been called into question. He thought about his conversations with Hendrickson, about the books he had read and the English he had learned, about the friendships he had formed with other prisoners and even, in a carefully bounded way, with some of the American guards. On his last day at Camp McCoy, Hendrickson came to say goodbye. They stood together in the administration building, Hayashi translating one final time, and there was a moment of awkward uncertainty about how to conclude their improbable relationship. Finally, Yamamoto bowed deeply, the formal bow of profound respect, and said through the translator, "Thank you for the letter. Thank you for seeing us as human beings. I will never forget what that meant." Hendrickson returned the bow, not quite as deeply but with obvious sincerity. "I hope you find your family safe," he said. "I hope you find a Japan that is at peace. And I hope that in some small way, the time you spent here might contribute to building a better understanding between our peoples." They shook hands then, an American gesture that Yamamoto had learned during his captivity, and the schoolteacher from Hiroshima walked out of Camp McCoy and toward the train that would take him to a ship bound for Japan. He carried with him very few physical possessions, just the clothes he wore and a small bundle of personal items, but he also carried something less tangible and infinitely more valuable, a memory of kindness at a moment of despair, a welcome written in his own language by a man who could have chosen cruelty instead, a seed of hope planted in the ruins of war. Years later, long after both men had returned to their civilian lives, Hendrickson to his teaching, Yamamoto to rebuilding his career in a transformed Japan, they would occasionally exchange letters. The correspondence was irregular and often delayed by the vagaries of international mail, but it continued, a thin thread of connection across the Pacific. They wrote about their families, about the work of reconstruction and reconciliation, about the challenges of explaining the war to younger generations who had not lived through it. They never forgot that they had once been enemies, but they also never forgot that a single letter, written with care and humanity, had opened a door to something beyond enmity. The welcome letter itself, the original document that had hung on the barracks wall at Camp McCoy, was eventually taken down and archived when the camp closed its prisoner operations. It ended up in a box in a military records facility, filed away with thousands of other documents from the war, seemingly destined for obscurity. But decades later, a historian researching the treatment of Japanese POWs in American camps discovered it and recognized its significance. The letter was photographed, transcribed, and published in a scholarly article about the psychology of captivity and the role of cultural sensitivity in military operations. From there, it found its way into museums and educational materials, becoming a small but powerful testament to the possibility of maintaining humanity even in the midst of humanity's greatest failures. For those who read it now, removed from the immediate context of war, the welcome letter might seem unremarkable, just a simple communication about rules and procedures, a basic acknowledgement of Geneva Convention requirements. But for the men who received it in that camp yard in Wisconsin in 1945, for men like Yamamoto who had crossed an ocean expecting death and found instead a gesture of recognition and respect, the letter was revolutionary. It was proof that even when nations were locked in existential conflict, even when propaganda had stripped away the humanity of the enemy, even when young men had been sent to kill and die for reasons they only partially understood, it was still possible for individual acts of kindness to pierce through the darkness. The story of the welcome letter raises questions that have no easy answers. What obligations do we owe to our enemies? How do we maintain our humanity when we are asked to fight and kill? What role can small gestures of respect and recognition play in healing the wounds that violence opens? These are not abstract philosophical questions, they are urgent, practical challenges that face every generation in different forms. The cowboys and soldiers of Camp McCoy, with their unlikely decision to welcome Japanese prisoners in their own language, offered one possible answer, that our shared humanity can be acknowledged even across the deepest divides, that the choice to see the person rather than just the enemy is always available to us, even when everything in our culture and our circumstances pushes us toward dehumanization. The desert wind that blew across Camp McCoy on that August day in 1945 has long since passed, carrying with it the dust and heat of that moment. The barracks are gone, the fences dismantled, the men who lived through those days aging and dying, their stories fading into history. But the letter remains, preserved in archives and memories, a small monument to the possibility of grace in the midst of war. It reminds us that we are always making choices about how to treat those we have power over, that cruelty and kindness are both options available to us, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to speak to another human being in their own language, to welcome them when they expect only condemnation, to build a bridge where others would be content with a wall. In the end, the welcome letter at Camp McCoy was not just about prisoners and captors, not just about Americans and Japanese, not just about World War II. It was about the fundamental question of what it means to be human, about our capacity to recognize ourselves in the eyes of those we have been taught to hate, about the small, brave acts of decency that can light the way forward even in the darkest times. It was a letter that crossed an ocean of silence and violence to say something simple but profound: you are seen. You are human. You are welcome. And in a world that still struggles with division and conflict, with dehumanization and violence, that message remains as necessary and revolutionary as it was on that long-ago afternoon in Wisconsin, when the sound of Japanese words spoken with respect cut through the tension of a prison camp and opened a door to something better than war.